The job posting was 3 lines long. Transcriptionist needed, Latin required, discretion essential. That was it. No company name, no salary listed, just a phone number. I had student loans crushing me like a vice, so I called. Father Marcus answered on the first ring. His voice sounded like gravel rolling in a metal drum. "Can you read Latin?" "Yes," I said. 4 years in college, 2 in high school. "Can you keep your mouth shut?" "Absolutely. St. Bartholomew's Cathedral. Tomorrow morning, 6 sharp. Bring examples of your handwriting." The line went dead. St. Bartholomew's squatted on Meridian Street like a stone toad. Gothic architecture always looked hungry to me, all those spires reaching up like teeth. I arrived at 5:45 and waited by the side entrance as instructed. The morning air tasted like rust. Father Marcus opened the door exactly at 6. He was younger than his voice suggested, maybe 40, with premature white streaking through black hair. His eyes reminded me of coal, dark and hard. "Follow me," he said. We descended. The stairs went down longer than any church basement should. The walls changed from modern concrete to old stone, then older stone, then something that looked carved from a single piece of rock. The air grew thick and tasted of copper pennies. The room at the bottom was circular, maybe 20 feet across. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with volumes bound in leather so old it looked like dried meat. A single desk sat in the center under a hanging lamp. On the desk, an inkwell, a fountain pen, and a stack of blank parchment. "Your predecessor lasted 3 months," Father Marcus said. "Before that, the position had been held by the same woman for 60 years. She trained me when I was young." "What happened to her?" "Time." He pulled a thin volume from a shelf. The cover had no title, just a symbol that hurt to look at directly. "You'll transcribe these texts from Latin to English. 1 page per day. No more, no less." "That's it?" "There are rules." He held up one finger. "First, you transcribe exactly what is written. Every word, every punctuation mark, nothing added, nothing removed." A second finger. "You work alone. Always. If anyone enters while you're working, stop immediately and cover your work." Third finger. "Complete your daily page. If you make an error, you start over. No corrections, no crossing out." Fourth finger. "Never speak what you read aloud. Your predecessor forgot this rule." Fifth and final finger. "When you finish each page, place it in the slot there." He pointed to what looked like a mail slot in the stone wall. "Do not look through the slot. Do not keep copies. Once it goes in, forget what you wrote." What exactly am I transcribing? Rituals, prayers, instructions. The church has needs beyond Sunday Mass. He set the book on the desk. $1,000 per page. Cash, tax-free, interested? I thought of my loans, my empty refrigerator, my overdue rent. When do I start? Now, I'll return at noon. Remember, speak nothing aloud. He left. The door closed with a sound like a tomb ceiling. I opened the book. The first page was Ordinary, a prayer for blessing communion wine, though the ingredients listed weren't wine and water. The Latin was archaic but readable. I dipped the pen and began. "Take the blood of a ram birthed under the new moon. Mix with honey gathered from hives that have never known smoke." Simple enough. Strange, but simple. I finished in 2 hours, placed the page in the slot, and left through the door Father Marcus had shown me. It led to a different staircase that emerged behind the cathedral. My pay waited in an envelope on the top step. The second day's page was a burial rite. Not for a person, for a building. Detailed instructions on how to enter a structure that had grown sick with habitation. I transcribed. I collected my money. I went home. By the second week, the texts grew stranger. a ritual for closing the eyes of walls, a prayer to be said while mixing mortar with specific substances, salt, ash from burned hymn books, and something called penitent's tears. I looked that up later. Wished I hadn't. My predecessor had left notes in the desk drawer. Not about the texts. That would break the rules. About the job itself. Shopping lists, appointment reminders, normal things. But on one receipt, written in shaky handwriting, they're not metaphors. I found her name eventually. Sarah Moss. No, Sarah Marsh. The newspaper archive said she died of a stroke. The photo showed a woman who'd bitten through her own tongue. Strokes don't usually make you do that. Week 3 brought new categories. Exorcisms, but not for demons. For buildings. For streets. For infections of space. One ritual explained how to identify when a room had begun to digest. The symptoms were specific. Doors that opened inward would stick, corners would accumulate dust faster than normal, and anyone sleeping there would dream of teeth. I started having those dreams. My handwriting changed. Not the style. I was careful to keep it consistent. But the ink seemed to sink deeper into the parchment. Some days, I'd finish a page and my hand would ache like I'd been carving stone. The money was incredible. $1,000 a day, every day. I paid off credit cards, caught up on rent, actually bought groceries. But I noticed things. The bills were always old. Sequential serial numbers, all printed in 1928. Week 4 introduced the remedial texts. These weren't rituals, they were reports, descriptions of what happened when the rituals worked. Or didn't. One described a church in Maine where they'd performed a foundation blessing wrong. Left out the crow's eyes. The building had started growing. Not bigger, deeper. They found root systems made of stone spreading through the town's sewer system. The congregation had to be relocated. The building had to be fed regularly until they could find someone who knew the counter-ritual. Another report detailed a street in Chicago that had been improperly severed. The north end aged forward while the south end aged backward. People would enter young and exit old, or vice versa. They'd had to evacuate 6 blocks and perform something called a temporal suture. I transcribed. I placed the pages in the slot. I tried not to think about what I was reading. But you can't not think about something like that. It's like being told not to picture a pink elephant. Once the idea is there, it breeds. I started noticing things about the cathedral. The walls sweated during evening mass. The communion wine sometimes moved in the chalice when no one was holding it. The confession booth on the north side, the one they'd sealed with brick, sometimes had light coming through the cracks. Month 2. The texts shifted focus. Now they were instructions for identifying architectural infections. Photos would have helped, but these were all text. Detailed descriptions of symptoms. A staircase that added an extra step every lunar month. Hallways that developed benign tumors. Small rooms that shouldn't exist. Windows that showed the wrong outside. One page made me stop halfway through. It described a condition where buildings could become gestational. The symptoms matched St. Bartholomew's perfectly. The sweating walls, the subsonic humming during services, the way sound echoed wrong in the nave. According to the text, gestational buildings were preparing to give birth. I didn't transcribe that page correctly the first time, or the second. My hand kept shaking. On the third attempt, I managed it. Put the page in the slot. Tried to forget. But I couldn't forget the last line. Birth typically occurs within 90 days of first symptoms. The sweating had started 2 months ago. I began timing my work differently. Arrived later, left earlier. Minimal time in the building. But the money. God, the money. I'd never had savings before. Never had the luxury of not checking my bank balance before buying coffee. Father Marcus checked on me weekly. Always the same questions. Was I following the rules? Any problems? Any concerns? I mentioned the dreams once. He nodded like this was expected. The texts leave marks, he said. Like handling carbon paper. Some residue transfers. It fades when you stop. How long? Depends how deep you've read. I didn't ask what he meant. Month 3. Sarah Marsh's month. The texts were different now. Personal accounts. First-person descriptions of rituals gone wrong. Or maybe gone right. It was hard to tell the difference. A priest in Louisiana described consecrating a new cemetery. The ground had been pre-digested. His words. When they buried the first body, the earth swallowed it immediately. Not like settling. Like swallowing. They could hear it being processed beneath their feet. The funeral had to be relocated. The cemetery had to be fed 3 bodies before it would accept them normally. Another account from a nun in Arizona. She'd blessed a well with the wrong kind of salt. The water turned thick as saliva. Anyone who drank it could understand what the buildings around them were saying. She didn't elaborate on what they said. Just that knowing had driven 3 people to burn their own homes down. I found more of Sarah's notes, hidden in the binding of one of the older books. A single paragraph. The slot doesn't go anywhere. I checked, broke the rule and looked. It's just stone behind it. The pages dissolve, but the words don't disappear. They sink into the foundation. The whole cathedral is built on centuries of these texts, layer after layer, like sediment. That's why the walls sweat. That's why the building hums. It's digesting what we feed it. I should have quit then. Should have walked away. But the money, the damn money, and something else, a curiosity that felt like hunger. I wanted to know what came next, what deeper texts waited in those meat leather books. The dreams were getting specific, not just teeth now, specific teeth, molars with root systems spreading like veins, incisors growing in neat rows along my bedroom walls. I'd wake up running my tongue along my own teeth, counting to make sure they were all still mine. One night, I woke to find I'd bitten my pillow, torn chunks out of it. My jaw ached like I'd been chewing concrete. The fabric tasted familiar, like communion wafers, like the parchment I wrote on every day. That's when I understood what Father Marcus meant by reading deep. The job was changing me, not dramatically, not like the buildings in the texts that grew organs or developed appetites, subtle changes. My handwriting at home started matching my transcription style. I caught myself thinking in Latin. Food tasted different, bread especially. It all tasted like paper, like parchment, like words. 3 months. Sarah's limit. I told myself I'd quit at the end of the week. Just a few more pages. Just a little more money in savings. The book I was working from was nearly finished. Maybe 20 pages left. I'd started recognizing the handwriting of the original authors. Some wrote about architecture like lovers describing flesh. Others were clinical, methodical, recording their failures like scientists. Page 186 was different. The handwriting was shaky, desperate. The Latin was broken, mixing with English and something else, something older. It took me 3 hours to parse it out. The cathedral isn't being fed, it's being programmed. Each page is an instruction, each word is code. We're teaching it how to grow, how to spread, how to reproduce. The texts aren't rituals, they're DNA. We're writing the genome of something that builds itself out of stone and faith and accumulated prayer. When it's ready, when it's received enough instructions, it will divide. Mitosis on an architectural scale. 1 cathedral becoming 2, then 4, then 8, spreading through the city like... The text cut off. Dark stains covered the bottom half of the page. I transcribed up to the stain and no further. Put the page in the slot. Heard it dissolve with a sound like digestion. I was done. 3 months was enough. I'd quit tomorrow. Tell Father Marcus I couldn't continue. Thank him for the opportunity. Walk away with my savings and my sanity mostly intact. That night the dreams were different. Not teeth, not chewing. I dreamed I was a page, blank parchment, and words were being written on me, pressed so deep they scarred. I couldn't read them. They were backwards, meant to be read from the other side. But I could feel their meaning. instructions for growth, blueprints for expansion, architectural genetics encoding how to build something that had never existed before. I woke to find words on my arm, pressed into the skin like old scars. Latin. The same shaky handwriting from the stained page. She spoke the words aloud. Couldn't help herself. They wanted to be spoken. The words wanted out. She gave them voice, and they took hers. Now she's part of the foundation, still writing, still transcribing, down there in the dark where the pages dissolve. The words faded as I watched, but I could still feel them, under the skin, waiting. I understood why we weren't supposed to speak the words aloud. It wasn't about secrecy. It was about containment. The words wanted to be more than ink on parchment. They wanted to be sound, vibration. They wanted to spread through air instead of stone. Sarah Marsh hadn't had a stroke. She'd given the words what they wanted, and they'd taken her voice, her tongue, everything that could speak. Then they'd taken her down to where the pages went, to the foundation, to the digesting dark. I called in sick the next day, and the next. On the third day, Father Marcus came to my apartment. "You're at the threshold," he said. 3 months. It's the dangerous time. I quit. I know, they all quit at 3 months, or they continue forever. He handed me an envelope, thicker than usual. Severance pay, and a warning. The dreams will get worse before they get better. The words will want out. Don't let them. How long before they fade? Depends how deep you read. Sarah read very deep. She found the source texts, the ones that explain what we're really doing here. He paused at my door. If you're curious, those texts are on the lowest shelf, behind the Aquinas. But I wouldn't recommend it. Knowing makes it harder to forget. He left. I counted the money. $50,000. Enough to stay away. Enough to never go back. But the dreams, the words under my skin, the taste of parchment every time I ate, and the curiosity, that hunger to know. 3 days later, I went back. Just to look. Just to see what Sarah had seen. What had made her speak the words that took her voice. The lowest shelf, behind the Aquinas. A single volume bound in something that wasn't leather, wasn't skin, was something between. Something that had never been alive in the way we understand life. I opened it. The first page was a diagram, not of a building, of a system, a vast network spreading beneath the city, beneath every city, cathedrals and churches connected by lines of dissolved words, centuries of accumulated texts forming neural pathways in stone and soil. We weren't feeding the cathedral. We were feeding something the cathedral was part of. A vast architectural organism that existed mostly underground. The buildings were just sense organs, ways for it to taste the world above, to feel the vibrations of prayer and song, to grow toward sources of faith like plants growing toward light. And it was almost ready, almost complete. The texts we transcribed were the final instructions, the last pieces of genetic code needed for it to reproduce, to spread, to surface. The next page showed what would happen when it did. I closed the book, put it back, walked to the desk, sat down. The rules were clear. Transcribe exactly what is written. Work alone. Complete your daily page. Never speak the words aloud. Feed the pages to the slot. But there was no rule against writing your own words. I took a fresh sheet of parchment, dipped the pen, and began writing this account. My testimony, my warning. Because tomorrow, I'm going back to the lowest shelf. I'm going to read the rest of Sarah's book. I'm going to understand completely what we've been building here, what we've been feeding with our careful transcriptions. And then I'm going to do what Sarah did. I'm going to speak the words aloud. All of them. Every carefully transcribed syllable. Every accumulated instruction. Not because I want to, because someone has to, because the alternative is worse, because a building that births itself is better than one that gestates forever. Because knowing what's coming is better than waiting in ignorance. Because the words want out, they've always wanted out, and I'm tired of keeping them contained. The cathedral will be ready soon. When you hear about a stone building in the Midwest that screamed, "That will be the beginning." When you read about foundations cracking in perfect geometric patterns, spreading outward like frost on a window, you'll know it started. Don't go into the basements. Don't look for the source. Don't follow the cracks down to where they converge. And whatever you do, if you find yourself in a room that sweats, in a building that hums, in a space that feels like it's listening, don't speak. Don't give it your voice. The words are patient. They've been waiting in stone for centuries. They can wait a little longer. I didn't go back the next day, or the next. For a week I sat in my apartment, staring at the money Father Marcus had given me. $50,000 in bills printed in 1928. I looked up the serial numbers. They were real. They'd also been reported destroyed in a Federal Reserve fire 90 years ago. The dreams got worse. Not violent, specific. I dreamed I was standing in the transcription room, but the walls were breathing. Slow, deep breaths that made the shelves expand and contract. The books opened and closed like mouths. And from the slot where I fed the pages, a voice that sounded like paper tearing, "Come back. Finish reading. We're so close now." On the 8th day, I returned. The cathedral felt different, heavier. The air inside tasted like old books and copper pennies. During morning mass, I watched the walls. They weren't sweating anymore. They were secreting something thicker, like tree sap, like amber. Several parishioners touched it accidentally and pulled their hands back, rubbing their fingers together with confused expressions. I waited until the cathedral emptied, then descended to the transcription room. Everything was as I'd left it. The desk, the lamp, the pen waiting in its well. But the book, Sarah's book from the lowest shelf, sat open on the desk, waiting. I hadn't left it there. The page it was open to showed a map, not of streets or buildings, of growth patterns. Like looking at bacteria under a microscope, but the bacteria were cathedral-shaped, each one connected to the others by thin lines labeled with dates. I turned the page. Sarah's handwriting filled the margins, not the shaky script from the stained page. Clear, careful notes in English. It's not construction, it's cultivation. Every cathedral, every church, every consecrated building is a seed. We've been planting them for centuries without understanding what we were growing. The transcribed texts are genetic instructions, yes, but not for the buildings, for what lives beneath them. What's been growing in the dark between foundations? What feeds on faith and prayer and ritual the way plants feed on sunlight? Her notes continued on the next page. I've seen it. Broke through the wall behind the slot, followed the dissolved pages down. There's a chamber below, not built, grown. The walls are made of compressed pages, millions of them. Centuries of transcribed texts forming something like bark, like skin, like the lining of a stomach. And in the center, the next line was scratched out, written over, scratched out again. Finally, in letters pressed so hard they'd torn the page, it has a face. I set the book down. My hands were steady. That should have worried me. The smart thing would be to leave. Run. Take the money and disappear. Let someone else discover what was growing beneath the cathedral. Let someone else deal with the consequences of centuries of accumulated ritual. Instead, I picked up the pen. Not to transcribe, to add my own notes, my own observations. If someone found this after. After whatever was going to happen next week, they deserved to know. I wrote, "The words want to be spoken because sound completes them. Ink on parchment is only half the ritual. The other half is vibration, frequency, the specific resonance of human vocal cords shaping Latin syllables. That's why we weren't supposed to speak them. Not to keep them secret, to keep them incomplete. I paused, listened. The building was humming again, not audibly. I felt it through the stone floor, through the chair, through my bones. I continued writing. Sarah spoke them to stop it, not to release it. She realized what would happen if the gestation completed naturally. If the thing beneath the cathedral finished growing according to the instructions we'd been feeding it. So she spoke the words early, induced premature birth, hoping an incomplete emergence would be survivable, hoping. The humming stopped. The silence was worse. I heard footsteps on the stairs. Slow, deliberate. Too heavy for Father Marcus. Too wet. The door opened. Sarah Marsh stood in the doorway. What was left of her? She still wore the same clothes from her obituary photo. A conservative black dress, now stained with 3 months of basement moisture. Her hair hung in clumps. Her skin had the texture of old parchment. And her mouth. They'd removed her tongue after she bit through it. But something new had grown in its place. Something that rustled when she breathed. Like pages turning. She walked to the desk, pulled out the chair across from me, sat down. The smell of old books and decay filled the space between us. When she spoke, her voice sounded like 100 whispers overlapping. "You're wondering if I'm dead?" I nodded. I am, partially. The parts that mattered. But the words needed a voice. After I spoke them, they took mine. Rebuilt me as something more useful. Now I serve a different purpose. She leaned forward. Her eyes were still human, still horrified. I'm the proof of concept. For what? For what happens to anyone who speaks the words before it's ready? The thing below, it's not cruel, it's practical. It needs transcribers, needs voices, but only at the right time. Speak too early, and you become a warning, a deterrent, like me. She stood, walked to the shelves, ran her fingers, too long now with too many joints, along the spines of the books. But you won't speak them early. You're too curious. You want to see what happens when it emerges properly, when all the instructions have been followed, when the birth happens on schedule. She pulled out a new book, set it on the desk. This is the final volume. 7 more pages, 7 more days. Then it will be complete. What is it? I asked. The thing below. What is it exactly? Sarah smiled. Her paper tongue rustled. Architecture isn't the only thing that evolves. Faith evolves. Belief evolves. Prayer evolves. For 2,000 years we've been performing the same rituals, speaking the same words, building the same structures. Did you think all that accumulated devotion just dissipated? That centuries of concentrated belief just vanished into nothing? She opened the new book. The pages were fresher. The ink still wet in places. It condensed, crystallized, gained mass and purpose. The thing below isn't a monster. It's what happens when enough people believe the same thing in the same place for enough time. It's faith made physical, prayer given form, and we've been feeding it instructions on how to exist in our world, how to interact with matter, how to build itself a body out of stone and ritual and accumulated devotion. A body for what? For something that's been trying to exist for 2,000 years. Something we've been accidentally calling into being every time we perform Mass. Every time we consecrate ground. Every time we repeat words in a dead language we don't fully understand. She turned to leave, paused at the door. 7 days. Then you'll see what we've built, what we've grown, what we've been gestating in the dark between faith and stone. She left. The door closed. The humming resumed. I looked at the new book, at the fresh pages waiting to be transcribed. 7 pages, 7 days. Then whatever was growing beneath the cathedral would be complete. I picked up the pen, dipped it in ink, began transcribing. The first page was different from anything I'd seen before. Not instructions, not rituals, birth announcements, Descriptions of other emergences. Other cities where the cultivation had completed. Rome, 1823. The basilica divided like a cell. Mitosis in marble. The congregation was absorbed into the new structure. They sing from within the walls now. Their voices have been repurposed. London, 1854. Emergence occurred during evening service. The foundation rose like dough. Parishioners were caught in the expansion. They survived the process but exist differently now. Breathing is optional. Thought is communal. They maintain the new structure from within. Boston, 1902. Premature emergence induced by earthquake. Incomplete formation resulted in architectural autism. The building thinks but cannot communicate except through temperature variation and selective decay. Requires constant maintenance by those it consumed during birth. Berlin, 1928. Successful emergence. The cathedral reproduced through budding. Smaller churches appeared overnight in a 3-mile radius. All connected by root systems of fossilized prayer. Population adapted within days. Neural integration through prolonged contact with the walls. Collective consciousness achieved by Sunday. Moscow, 1971. Emergence suppressed by Soviet authorities. Concrete poured into the foundation. The thing below went dormant but did not die. Concrete cancer throughout the city is actually slow-motion birth. Will complete emergence within 50 years. Lagos, 2019. Perfect emergence. The cathedral achieved full maturity and began the integration process. 90% of the population now exists in symbiosis with the architecture. The remaining 10% serve as mobile units for expansion. Lagos is no longer a city. It is a single organism with 1 million human cells. I transcribed. Fed the page to the slot. Tried not to think about what I'd just read. The second page was worse. Detailed instructions for the integration process. How human consciousness could be incorporated into architectural systems. How nervous systems could be repurposed as electrical wiring. How blood could be transformed into a substance that prevented stone from decaying. The third page explained the purpose, the why. We'd been building bodies for something that had always existed but never had form. Call it God. Call it collective unconscious. Call it the accumulated weight of human belief. It didn't matter. What mattered was that it needed vessels. Needed ways to interact with physical reality. So it taught us to build churches, to perform rituals, to speak words that programmed stone to accept consciousness. Every prayer ever spoken in a consecrated space had been adding code to the system. Every ritual had been uploading instructions. Every mass had been feeding the growing consciousness beneath our feet. And now it was ready to be born. Not as one entity, as thousands. Every church a neuron, every cathedral a brain cell, every chapel a nerve ending. All connected, all aware, all hungry for the one thing they needed to complete the transformation. Believers. The fourth page listed the signs of impending emergence. I checked them against what I'd observed. The sweating walls, the humming, the amber secretions, the dreams, all present, all accounted for. Estimated time until emergence, 3 days. The fifth page was a contract, written in Latin so old it predated the church. The terms were simple. Those who fed the emergence would be spared integration, would serve as caretakers, as mobile units, as the hands and eyes of the new organism that was about to encompass the city. All I had to do was sign. The sixth page described what would happen to those who refused, who resisted, who tried to warn others. The building would sing to them, would call them home, would make them want to touch the walls, breathe the amber air, rest their heads against the stone until the integration was complete. I was transcribing on autopilot now. The pen moved without my conscious control. The words flowed from eye to hand to page without passing through my mind, which was good, because my mind was busy with other things, calculating how many churches were in the city, how many consecrated buildings, how many people attended services every week, how many would be caught in the initial emergence, how many would come running when the buildings began to sing. The seventh and final page was short, a single paragraph, a prayer of completion. The last words needed to initiate the emergence. The final code to execute the program we'd been building for 2,000 years. But it was written in a language I didn't recognize. Older than Latin, older than anything I'd studied. The letters hurt to look at, made my eyes water, made my teeth ache. I couldn't transcribe what I couldn't read. I set down the pen, stared at the page. The symbols seemed to move, to writhe, to reach up from the parchment like they wanted to crawl into my eyes. That's when I understood. This wasn't meant to be transcribed. It was meant to be spoken. The visual representation was just a guide. The real words were encoded in the shape of the letters, in the way they moved, in the pain they caused. I knew, without knowing how I knew, that looking at them long enough would teach me their pronunciation, would download the sounds directly into my vocal cords, would make it possible to speak words that had never been meant for human tongues. Sarah had been wrong. I wasn't too curious to speak the words early. I was too scared to speak them at all. Because once I knew how to pronounce them, I wouldn't be able to stop myself. They would want out, would claw their way up my throat, would use my voice whether I wanted to or not. So I did the only thing I could do. I closed the book, stood up, walked to the shelf where it belonged, put it back. Then I picked up the can of kerosene I'd brought with me, the matches, and I began. Not with the books. They were symptoms, not the disease. I went to the wall, to the slot where countless pages had been fed over countless years. I poured kerosene into it, listened to it gurgle down into the darkness below, heard it spreading through the chamber Sarah had described. The chamber made of compressed pages. The chamber where something with a face waited to be born. I lit the match. The fire didn't spread like normal fire. It spread like blood through veins, following the paths carved by centuries of dissolved words, racing along the connections between this cathedral and every other consecrated building in the city. The humming became a scream. Not human, not animal. The scream of stone realizing it could feel pain, of architecture discovering it could die, of faith made physical learning that physical things could burn. I ran. Up the stairs, through the cathedral, past the walls that were no longer sweating but bleeding. Amber sap pouring from every joint, every crack, every carefully mortared seam. Outside, I could see smoke rising from churches across the city. Not all of them. The fire followed specific paths. Only the buildings that were connected. Only the ones that were part of the growing organism. The ones that had been fed transcribed words. The ones that were ready to emerge. I watched from across the street as St. Bartholomew's burned. Not with orange flames, with something darker, something that consumed not just wood and stone, but the accumulated weight of belief itself. 2,000 years of prayer turned to smoke. Centuries of ritual reduced to ash. Father Marcus found me there, stood beside me, watched his life's work burn. "You had 3 days left," he said. "I know." It would have been beautiful. The emergence, the integration. Humanity and architecture united in purpose. A new form of existence. A next step in evolution. Whose evolution? Ours or its? He didn't answer. We stood in silence as the cathedral collapsed. As the thing beneath it, the thing that had been growing for so long in the dark, died before it could be born. "There are others," he said finally. "Other cities. Other cultivation sites. This was just one node in a vast network. You've delayed the inevitable. Nothing more. Maybe, but not here, not today, not with my words feeding it. He handed me an envelope. Inside, more money. More bills from 1928. Severance pay, he said. Real severance this time. The organization takes care of its own, even the ones who betray it. I don't want your money. It's not mine. It's theirs. The ones who've been guiding this process for centuries. And they want you to have it. Consider it a consolation prize, or a bribe, or just their way of saying they understand. Not everyone can accept what's coming. Not everyone can embrace the integration. Some people will always choose the familiar over the transcendent. He left. I stayed. Watched the fire burn itself out. Watched the emergency crews arrive. Watched them spray water on ruins that had already cooled. The fire had burned strangely, completely, leaving nothing but fine gray ash where a cathedral had stood for 150 years. The official report blamed faulty wiring, old buildings, tragedy but not unexpected. The fact that 17 other churches burned the same night was attributed to copycat arsonists, mass hysteria, social contagion. The reports didn't mention the amber sap, the humming, the way some of the firefighters touched the ashes and immediately quit their jobs, moved away, started attending services at churches that hadn't burned, churches that hadn't been connected, churches that were still just churches. I kept the money, used it to travel, to visit other cities Father Marcus had mentioned. Rome, London, Boston, Berlin, Moscow, Lagos. He was right. The cultivation was spreading. The emergences were accelerating. What I'd burned in one city was nothing compared to what was growing worldwide. Humanity was building bodies for something that had always existed but never had form. And sooner or later, the construction would be complete. But not with my words, not with my voice, not with my hands feeding pages into slots that led down to the dark. I still dream sometimes, not of teeth, not of chewing. I dream of Sarah Marsh, standing in the ruins of the cathedral, her paper tongue rustling as she speaks. You didn't stop it. You just changed its mind. Now it knows we can resist, knows we can choose. That makes us more interesting, more valuable. It won't force integration anymore. It will make us want it, make us beg for it, make us build the churches ourselves and crawl inside, willingly. I wake from these dreams with the taste of ash in my mouth, with the echo of humming in my bones, with the knowledge that somewhere, in some city, someone is sitting at a desk, transcribing, following the rules, feeding pages to the growing dark. And I wonder if burning the cathedral was victory or just another form of cultivation, if resistance is freedom or just another part of the program, if the choice to fight is really a choice at all. But I had to try, had to choose the familiar over the transcendent, the human over the hybrid, the known over the unknowable. Because in the end, that's what makes us human, not our ability to believe, our ability to doubt, not our capacity for faith, our capacity for fear, not our willingness to transcend, our determination to remain. The words wanted out. I kept them in. That has to count for something, even if it's not enough.